I lived in a peaceful home until things changed. My name is Nancy, and I was raised in what I thought was the perfect family. My dad was the provider, strong, hardworking, and always there for me. My mom was warm and nurturing, keeping everything in order from the meals we ate to the love that bound us together. They seemed like a perfect match, a pair that defied the odds of modern relationships. Growing up, I looked up to my dad. He was my hero. When I was younger, I would follow him around the house, helping out. He loved to start little things like car repairs, lawn mowing, or even the odd DIY project, but never quite finish them. As I grew older, our bond remained strong but took on a different form. We had more personal conversations than we used to, talking about everything from life to his dreams to my future. Sometimes things felt a little too personal for a father-daughter relationship, but I didn't see it as strange. Dad was just someone I could confide in. He was always there for me, even when my mom was busy or too tired to listen. We had this connection that was different from what I had with her, and I didn't think much of it until one day I noticed something odd. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. My mom had gone to visit a friend, leaving my dad and me alone in the house. Nothing unusual about that. We had spent time alone before, but something about that day felt different. The way he looked at me, the way he smiled when he talked. It was almost as if he was. At first, I just saw my dad as my dad. I didn't think much of it. After all, he'd always been kind and caring. But as time went on, I noticed little things that made me think there was more. Like how he'd brush my hair away from my face when I talked to him, or how his hugs lingered a second longer than they should have. Or how he seemed to be seeking my company more and more. It wasn't overt, and nothing inappropriate ever happened, but there was something there. There was a subtle but undeniable tension between us. I started to wonder if I was overthinking things. Perhaps I was just imagining the strange new dynamic. Still, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It didn't take long for it to become clear that I wasn't the only one noticing these changes. My mom had started acting differently too. She became more distant, watching us carefully when Dad and I would talk or share a laugh. I could see the suspicion in her eyes. I could see that she was growing in confidence, but I was determined not to believe that anything was wrong. The atmosphere in our house was changing. The once warm and loving environment was becoming tense, filled with unspoken words and lingering stares. I wanted to keep things normal, but I felt like I was stuck in the middle of something I didn't fully understand. As weeks passed, the tension in our house thickened. My mom's distant stares turned into cold silences, and my dad seemed increasingly drawn to me in ways that it was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. It was small, almost imperceptible gestures like him standing a little too close when we talked, or how he'd find excuses to wander around me even when there was no real need. It made me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I kept pushing the feelings aside. After all, this was my dad. He would never cross any lines. One evening after dinner, my mom suddenly stood up and announced she was going out. It wasn't like her to leave without telling us where she was going, but neither my dad nor I questioned her. As soon as my mom left the room, I noticed my dad's mood change. He seemed relieved and even excited. He suggested we watch a movie together. I tried to act normal, but something about being alone with him now felt different. There was an invisible line between us that was gradually being erased as we sat on the couch, the movie playing in the background. I could feel his eyes on me, not in the way a father usually watches his daughter, but in a way that made me feel self-conscious. I was aware of my heart racing, though I wasn't sure why. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in the room. Suddenly, Dad leaned over and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was an innocent gesture, but it felt heavy. His hand lingered, and I could feel the warmth of his touch seeping through my skin. I stiffened, unsure of how to react. He didn't move his hand, and instead turned towards me. Instead of moving his hand, he turned towards me, his face closer than it had ever been before. "Nancy," he said in a low, almost hesitant voice, "you know I'm always here for you. You can talk to me about anything." I nodded, but my throat felt tight. There was something about the way he said it that felt different. I wanted to believe he was just being the supportive dad I'd always known, but deep down I wasn't so sure anymore. I asked if everything was okay, hoping to steer the conversation back to normal. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to decide something. Then, just as quickly as the tension had built, he pulled his hand away and smiled. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said everything was fine. I got up quickly and went to check on something in the garage. As he left the room, I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. My mind was racing. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into innocent moments? I shook my head, trying to dispel the doubts clouding my thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the way my body reacted whenever he was around. That night, I had this strange feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying the events of the evening in my mind. I didn't want to believe that anything inappropriate was happening. After all, my dad hadn't done anything overt, but I had this feeling in my gut that something was going on. The next morning, my mom was even more distant. She barely spoke to my dad and her conversations with me were short and clipped. It seemed like she knew something but wasn't ready to confront it. I caught her watching me out of the corner of her eye, her face tense with unspoken questions. Days passed and the growing distance between my parents became apparent. It became more and more obvious that they were speaking less and showing less affection for each other. The house, which had once been full of laughter and light, felt like it was closing in on itself. The cracks in their relationship were getting wider, and I had no idea how to stop it. Then one afternoon, my mom approached me while my dad was at work. She had a worried look on her face and her voice was soft, which was unusual for her. She paused for a moment, as if she had something on her mind. "Has anything been going on between you and your father? Anything strange?" I froze. Her question was like a punch to the gut. Was she accusing me of something? Did she think I was doing something wrong? My mind raced as I tried to find the right words. "Mom, nothing's going on," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. Nothing had happened. But something was definitely off, and we both knew it. She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to figure out whether I was telling the truth. Finally, she sighed and nodded, but her expression told me she wasn't entirely convinced. "Okay," she said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure." As she walked away, a heavy weight settled in my chest. The cracks in our family were no longer there. Just beneath the surface, they were right there in plain sight, threatening to tear us apart. Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The days that followed my mom's quiet confrontation felt like living in a pressure cooker. My dad grew even more attentive, and his presence felt suffocating. My mom's distance turned into outright avoidance. We were no longer a family, we were three strangers in a house full of unspoken words and unseen barriers. I was stuck between them, feeling torn by the weight of my father's behavior and my mother's silent accusations. Then one evening everything came crashing down. It was late. I had already gone to bed when I heard my parents talking in hushed, angry voices in the living room. I tried to ignore it at first, pulling the covers over my head and hoping their argument would pass like it always did. But the tension in their voices kept pulling me in, making my stomach feel uneasy. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to hear what was being said. Their voices were clearer now, sharp and cutting through in the stillness of the night. "You think I don't see what's going on?" My mom's voice was cold, but her anger trembled underneath. "How she's been acting around her, how she's been avoiding me. Do you think I'm blind? Linda, stop it, you're blowing things out of proportion." My dad responded, his voice calmer but defensive. "She's our daughter. Nothing's happening. Don't lie to me." My mom shot back, her voice shaking with fury. She said she could see how I looked at her and that she'd seen me looking at my dad too. I felt awful. Did she think I was involved in this? That I wanted any of this? I would never hurt her dad. He said he loved her but that it wasn't like that. My mom's voice cracked. She said she didn't know me anymore. I know what's been going on between you two, but it's not normal and it's not right. I could hear the tears in her voice now, and my chest tightened. This was it, this was the moment when everything was falling apart. I knew I had to stop it before it got worse. Without thinking, I stepped out of my room and walked down the hallway toward the living room as I approached both of them. I turned to look at them, and I could see that they were both surprised and guilty. I said, "Mom, Dad, stop," in a quiet but firm voice. It was like a knife cutting through the tension. I could see that my mom was suspicious and hurt, but she knew something was wrong. She knew it too, Nancy. You felt it too. I hesitated, and that seemed to confirm her worst fears. I could see the betrayal in her eyes, and it hurt me in a way I hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what's going on," I said, my voice shaking, "but it's not what you think. Dad and I were just..." I paused, searching for the right words, but they wouldn't come. My dad stood there silent, as if he knew there was no way to fix this. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with regret. He looked like a man who had lost everything without realizing he was losing it. Mom stepped closer to me, her voice trembling with emotion. "Nancy, I love you, but I can't ignore what I've seen. There's something between you two. That shouldn't be there. It's not your fault, but it's not okay either." Tears were welling up in my eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen, I don't even know what's going on," and that was the truth. Whatever strange bond had grown between my father and me, I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't wanted it, but now it was destroying everything. That night, Dad spoke. "Linda, please. I never meant for any of this. I love you. I love both of you, but things have been off, and I don't know how we got here." My mom shook her head. Said her voice was steady but broken. "It's too late, Richard. I can't trust you anymore. I can't trust this family anymore." Her words hung in the air like a final judgment. The weight of it all crashed down around us, and I felt like I was suffocating under the pressure of a reality I didn't fully understand. In the days that followed, my mom packed her bags and left the house. She didn't say goodbye or even look back. It was as if she had already mourned the loss of our family long before she walked out the door. Dad tried to say sorry and explain to Lane, but there was nothing more he could do. The damage had been done and no amount of words could fix things. I stayed with my dad for a while after that, but things were never the same again. The unspoken tension that had lingered between us for months was now a permanent fixture, a reminder of the invisible line that had been crossed. Even if neither of us fully understood how or why, eventually I moved out, desperate to escape the weight of the past. My relationship with my dad was still a bit strained, and my mom was pretty upset too. She never really forgave me, or him, or the situation. Our once peaceful home was gone, replaced by a silence that spoke louder than any argument ever could. In that silence, I realized that sometimes the things that destroy a family aren't the loud, obvious betrayals. Sometimes it's the quiet, subtle cracks that go unnoticed until it's too late to repair them. Years passed, and though the pain of what happened dulled over time, it never fully went away. My parents divorced and I found myself stuck in the middle of a rift that could never be healed. I tried to move on and build my own life away from the shadows of that broken home, but every now and then I'd catch myself thinking back to those moments, the unspoken tension, the things left unsaid, and wonder if there was something I could have done differently. I never spoke to my dad about that night again. We still talk, of course, but there's a distance between us now that can never be bridged. My parents remarried, and we're on speaking terms, but there's still a sense of betrayal and suspicion between us. Our family fell apart not because of an affair or betrayal, but because of a gradual loss of trust and boundaries. We lost something we could never get back, and that's the real tragedy. It's not about the affair that never happened, but the love that we couldn't hold on to.